A question that often comes up when assessing operators is whether or not an operator can be considered good or not if the operator is dependent on another operator to function. Personally, I think this is kind of a silly question, primarily because every operator does require additional support to some extent. Your snipers cannot block enemies just as your defenders aren't that great at damaging them. Medics are still good, not because they deal damage, but because the role they play is just insanely important. Honestly, the whole idea of the incantation medic is something I find to be quite lame. They exist to fix a non-issue with how medics function. Arknights is apparently a DPS game after all. We can't encourage synergistic thinking. Everything must be capable of doing damage. Jokes aside, I enjoy subclasses like bards, artificers, hexers, and abjurers because they add layers to the game's synergies and complexities, but they aren't without their criticisms. Why bring an operator that purely exists to make your other operators more efficient when you could just bring another already efficient operator? Why buff Cruce when you can just bring another marksman? Well, because you can't do cool shit like this otherwise. Ultimately, I am perfectly fine with operators existing in Arknights that don't purely exist to deal damage, or may require other operators to take full advantage of them. Arknights is a strategy game at heart. I don't feel operator quality should be determined purely by the brute force method of play. However, there is one subclass in the game that does suffer from some independence issues. Primal casters. Primal casters and Ritualists are subclasses focused around dealing elemental damage, as stated in their trait. However, they're not meant to be the same thing. Both subclasses are fundamentally different. Ritualists, the supporter archetype, are focused more on dealing elemental gauge damage, while Primal casters, the caster archetype, are more focused on dealing elemental damage. To clarify, elemental gauge damage is the damage that fills up the elemental gauge. It's tied to the element the operator wields and is sometimes parasitic to some other damage type that operator deals. Once 1,000 damage of the same element is dealt, the element's burst effect activates, which is either the DOT and weaken of necrosis or the insane burst damage and resistance reduction of burn. Elemental damage, on the other hand, is a damage type, akin to physical or arts damage. However, as it currently stands, no enemy in the game has elemental resistance above 0, so it's basically just true damage. The idea between Ritualists and Primal casters is that Ritualists focus more on filling the elemental gauge to activate the burst effects, while Primal casters enhance the burst effects with bonus damage. And so there is a balancing mechanism in place between Ritualists and Primal casters to make this the case. Remember how earlier I said that elemental gauge damage is sometimes parasitic towards another damage type? Well, Ritualists just apply elemental gauge damage right away, no strings attached. Primal casters, on the other hand, deal their elemental gauge damage as arts damage, which means it's susceptible to being reduced by normal resistance. Primal casters will never fill the elemental gauge bar as quickly as Ritualists do, and that's fine. They're not focused on consistently inflicting burst, they just want to embrace the burst. Primal casters instead get their main usage out of their talents and skill effects. If an enemy in range is under the effects of elemental burst, then they get some extra effect, usually just free elemental damage. This makes the synergy between Ritualists and Primal casters quite easy to understand, as you get the best of both worlds. You get the ease of application with Ritualists and the extra reward for reaching elemental burst with Primal casters. However, there is a single issue. Ritualists are fine. If you don't feel a Primal caster is necessary, then you can just use a Ritualist purely on their own and get the expected result out of them. Primal casters, on the other hand, only have half a kit if you aren't using a Ritualist, and in the case of Diamante and Wormy, their S2s don't naturally inflict elemental gauge damage, and as they have no alternative way of doing so, they become entirely reliant on a Ritualist to inflict the gauge damage for them. Same situation with Nymph, except it's her S3 that doesn't naturally inflict gauge damage. This goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of this video. Normally, I don't think there is anything wrong with an operator requiring some assistance to work at their full potential, but I do feel there's an issue if the operator cannot function as designed without some external help. Bards like Sora obviously don't do anything on their own, and thus would require some other operators to really do anything. However, there is no restriction as to what Sora can buff. Some operators are better buffed than others, and thus proper strategy can help you reach maximum potential with those operators. But at the baseline, Sora does everything she is designed to do with any operator. Well, excluding bards, they are unaffected by inspiration. Even Winflet, who is limited in what he can target, can at least buff himself. If you have no possible targets, Winflet is fully capable of standing alone as a somewhat beefy lane holder. But Primal casters aren't supporters, they're casters. They are casters who have a limited kit access unless you support them in a very specific way. This isn't a matter of limiting the maximum operator potential behind combos, it's limiting the operator's base function behind combos, and in an incredibly niche one at that. Currently, there are two Necrosis Ritualists in the game, Velarquivin and Virtuosa, and luckily, Velarquivin is a welfare operator. Wormy, on the other hand, doesn't have a single method of dealing external burn damage for her S2 to pop up. And even if she did, even if the burn ritualist was a welfare operator, it is still not good design to limit the base function of an operator behind some other operator that you may or may not have. If I want to use Wormy's S2, I better be sure that I not only own the make-believe burn ritualist, but I also put in the resources to build them. It's a completely unnecessary restriction that only hinders the operator's functionality. I am perfectly fine with the natural synergy of Ritualists and Primal casters. I'm also perfectly fine with how Wormy and Diamante's talents and S1s are designed. Their S1s are meant to make the application of elemental gauge damage easier with a slightly less powerful payoff, while the S2 completely forgoes elemental gauge damage with a stronger burst payoff. But rather than just simply reducing the elemental gauge damage dealt by these skills to balance them out, Hypergryph just removed the ability to deal elemental gauge damage from their S2s. So, what do? How can we fix this? The easiest solution is to just give Wormy, Diamante, and Nymph some kind of elemental gauge damage on all of their skills, so that even if they aren't the most efficient way of inflicting elemental gauge damage, you can still utilize these skills as intended without having to rely on bringing another operator to do the job for them. I am honestly a fan of the Ritualist and Primal caster dichotomy. I am just not a fan of not being allowed to use Wormy's S2 because Hypergryph... Well, there is no reason. Hypergryph is just being mean. Remember, there are no bad operators, just a severe lack of operator-inflicted nervous impairment. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a great day, and I love you all.